Dr. Carey Heller for a third in a series on ADHD and executive functioning. Dr. Heller, for those of you that haven't been with us, is a licensed psychologist and founding partner of Heller Psychology Group in Bethesda, Maryland. He specializes in evaluation and the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and executive functioning weaknesses. Dr. Heller often provides a blend of psychotherapy and practical coaching in helping children, adolescents, and adults get better organized, be more efficient, and improve their productivity. He's also involved with children and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or CHAD. He serves as the chapter coordinator for the Montgomery chapter and as the co-chair of the National Editorial Advisory Board. So we are the Family Support Center here on the line. I'm Marcy Torsion, I'm a program coordinator in the office. Yvette Young is also with us, so we will be monitoring the chat during the session. And with that, Dr. Heller, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me stop sharing my screen.
All right, thanks a lot for the great introduction. It's great to be back again. It's hard to believe this is the third and final session of this. I'm having a lot of fun with this. All right, so again, I'm not sure who's on here. Some people, you may have attended some of these before, so maybe the first one. Either way, it's perfectly fine. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, is that displaying properly?
Yep, it looks good.
All right, perfect. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about ADHD today. A few of the first slides, for those of you that have attended either the first or second one, maybe a little bit of a review. I'm going to try to go really quickly through the real basic stuff of it on ADHD, because I really want us to have plenty of time to go through and really talk about practical strategies, things that you guys can do at home or in the school to help, kids, your own kids or kids you're working with ADHD or related executive function issues. I sent a copy of the slides ahead of time, so you can certainly get a copy of them. We may not necessarily get through all the slides, but I purposely put in extra information in the slides. So even if we don't get to everything, you still have a lot of information to take home from today. So we're going to talk very briefly about what ADHD is. We're going to talk a little bit about how ADHD is evaluated, and then we're really going to focus really far more in depth on treatment, because there's a lot of different components to it. And it's not just the formal things, going to a doctor, but it's a lot of things you can be doing at home that can be really helpful in making things better and helping people to thrive with ADHD. Because it's definitely possible to thrive with ADHD. I mean, it shouldn't stop someone necessarily from going to college, doing whatever they want to do career-wise, but it's a matter of managing things and, taking a comprehensive approach at it. So it's not just medicine, but there's lots of things all together that really can help to make things a lot better. So let's jump right in. Okay, so what is ADHD? I mean, to get very technical, it's a disorder in the DSM, which is the criteria or the book that contains the criteria for different mental disorders. Basically, it's a disorder that involves issues with attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Again, not everyone has to have all of these symptoms. So some people with ADHD may just have primarily inattentive. It's possible some may just have the hyperactive, so impulsive. And there's the combined where you have enough significant issues with attention as well as hyperactivity and impulsivity. And hyperactivity is, sort of excessive fidgeting, not being able to sit still, kind of, the child that's, bouncing off the walls and can't sit still. The impulsivity is kids that are, or anyone really, that's, saying things without thinking, just, jumping up when they're really supposed to be staying in their seat, or impulsively saying something that's completely inappropriate without really having a filter. Okay, so what is executive functioning? Basically, the bottom line is that ADHD and other disorders can sometimes create symptoms that are under the umbrella of what's called executive functioning. So things like planning, organizing, task initiation, that they're sort of an umbrella. Executive functioning is an umbrella term, but it's relevant to ADHD because if you look at issues with attention, emotional control, planning, organizing, these are all things related to ADHD. So if someone has ADHD, by default, they have weaknesses in executive functioning as well. And they're essentially, connected. Okay, so how do ADHD and executive functioning deficits affect children and teens? So here you have a list of, probably what are some of the more typical ones, but to sort of put it in kind of, real life perspective, it's not just about the basics of someone who has a hard time focusing, but you want to think about the fact that imagine how hard it is if someone like generally they have a desire to focus. It's not like this someone with ADHD says, "Oh, I have no interest whatsoever in focusing." The idea is that usually they, on some level, have a desire to, at least deep down, but that in the moment there may be lots of other stuff going on in their head, or they're really easily distracted. Imagine how hard it is to stay focused on stuff when there's lots of random stuff that distracts you. I mean, I imagine it must be hard. I mean, I know for me, it would certainly be hard if there's something random that was distracting me while I was trying to do something. I don't know about you guys, but so, but again, that's and a little bit of what, just a sampling of what it may be like for someone that is basically can't sort of block out the extraneous stuff to be able to focus when they need to. Okay, so in terms of evaluating ADHD, obviously trying to figure out what's going on with your child or teen is sort of the first step, because it's hard to target any sort of treatment if you don't actually know what the issue is. There are different methods for getting an ADHD diagnosis, and there are pros and cons to each of them. I mean, oftentimes a pediatrician can be a good starting point to talk with them, get a sense of what they're seeing. Some pediatricians will do some sort of brief interview, have you and maybe a teacher complete some rating forms to make a diagnosis. I think sometimes that sort of is sufficient, but it also depends. Like if there's no concerns around anxiety, depression, learning issues, and it's pretty clear cut, then a pediatrician may be able to sort of evaluate that at times fairly well. But when there's any sort of concern about other stuff that may be going on, there's a lot that gets missed by not doing formal testing. And that's where, especially if you have any concerns around an underlying learning disability, like trouble with reading or writing, things like that could either be there in addition to ADHD or mimicking ADHD, and even also vision issues. So a lot of people don't think about this, but if people have issues with vision tracking, being able to kind of have the eyes work together, that in itself, it doesn't cause ADHD, but sometimes that can either be misdiagnosed as ADHD or an issue in addition to ADHD itself. So you really want to be thorough, and that's where a lot of times testing can be really helpful for looking at ADHD. But there's no one test that is sort of, it's not like strep or COVID-19 where basically you take a test and it's negative or it's positive. It's a compilation of different measures they use together to kind of arrive at a determination if there is ADHD or not. Okay, in terms of treatment, so we move pretty quickly into the treatment piece, because I think in some ways this is among probably the most important pieces of it, because once you know what's going on, this is where there's lots that you can do to make things better and really help your child or teen or even adult to thrive. Okay, so in terms of what are often referred to as behavioral treatments, so psychotherapy and ADHD or executive function coaching are probably two of the more common ones. What's hard is that with psychotherapy, there are some clinicians that know a lot about ADHD and really can target direct ADHD symptoms, or others that maybe may focus more on self-esteem or anger or other things that maybe are sort of there with the ADHD and secondarily causing issues, but may not necessarily be that great at knowing how to target ADHD directly. So that's where it becomes more important to understand what is the background of the person that you're working with. What are they able to do? What are they able to work with? Because that can help you decide. Because it's not one size fits all with a therapist. It's about figuring out someone that for ADHD knows what they're doing with ADHD, understands it, and can address whatever your child or teen's particular needs with ADHD are, since those can certainly vary. So ADHD and executive function coaching are, and again, there's a lot of variability in terms of people that have certifications, people that call themselves an executive function coach that honestly have no idea where their background is from because it doesn't seem to make sense. But like the idea, there's certainly very many people that are very qualified. My point though is that with something like coaching, because they're not always as much in the way of licensure or certification things, you always just want to take a look at someone's background if they say they're a coach of some kind and understand like what that is, to make sure that likely have training and would be a good fit for your child or teen. But basically what ADHD or executive function coaching is it's more of like a targeted approach. So it's working on, a lot of times it gets tied into school. So it's looking, sitting with your child or teen, helping them to look at the school planner or online portal, help them plan out assignments, work on time management, being able to make a plan and get it done. So a lot of like very nitty gritty stuff. Sometimes working on, let's say, creating a morning routine or setting up an evening routine. And again, a therapist can often do a lot of this, but it depends. Some therapists take a very active approach in sort of the kind of taking coaching elements, and others really don't. So that's where it's more important. It's more to interview the particular professional you may work with to figure out, where their specialty, what can they do? Because first of all, if you're putting money into it and time, you want to get as much out of it as you can. Plus, also, if you're doing something that's not that helpful to your child or teen, they're going to push back against it, and it's really not going to be helpful to anyone. In terms of pharmacological treatments, again, this is probably what people think about most often when you think about treatment for ADHD. Stimulant medications are, usually the most commonly prescribed type of medicine for ADHD. But, depending on, someone's presenting issues, that may not be appropriate for all people. And also, medicine, it helps a lot with, or can help a lot with focus, and, can reduce impulsivity and hyperactivity. But it's not going to magically give someone underlying executive function skills. It's not going to magically give them time management or organizational abilities. It may make it easier to implement strategies that they have, but it's not going to magically give them those, which is why behavioral supports are so important in addition to medication. There are other treatments as well that I think are less well known. To some degree, some of them are less well studied as well. But there are things like biofeedback or cogmed. And again, these are something that maybe good to look into if the primary methods of medication, therapy, coaching, the typical lifestyle changes, if that's sort of not enough to meet your needs, to figure out if there are alternative methods that would be a helpful addition to kind of more of a comprehensive treatment plan. Okay, so another big piece of this are thinking about combination sort of lifestyle changes, but also supports in different areas of a child or teen's life. So, for example, at school, obviously with ADHD, issues at school are often a big one, and one that can often be supported in addition to any other stuff you're doing at home. With something like a 504 plan or an IEP, basically having accommodations at school to help with however the functional impact of ADHD is. Because one thing to keep in mind is that just because someone has ADHD does not automatically mean that they qualify for any services at school. It's really about the functional impact that ADHD or any other issue they have for that matter has on their academic functioning. Because then what you're doing is you're targeting any accommodations in a 504 plan or IEP to where the difficulties are. So if, let's say, they need help with behavior regulation because of ADHD, then that might be something that would be part of a 504 plan or possibly an IEP. If they're really slow at getting stuff done because of ADHD and need extra time on tests, that would be an accommodation that would be addressed either because of low processing speed or because of the lack of attention that in turn creates sort of a sense of slow speed of completion. A lot of things you can really do at home that are vital. And again, most of the things I'm talking about are things that are really helpful for anyone, whether it's ADHD or not. But for people with ADHD, it's maybe even more helpful than the average person, but still extremely helpful for everyone, would be things like getting enough sleep. Pretty much anyone that's really sleep deprived is not going to function very well, and a lot of times could sort of look like they have ADHD in some ways in terms of slower rate of responding to things, being sort of less focused. So there's a lot that I don't know if anyone is sleep deprived at the moment, especially if you have real little kids or in general are sleep deprived. Certainly, you may be able to relate in the moment to what I'm talking about. Healthy use of technology is another piece, and again, I think there are different theories of thought on what's an appropriate use of how much technology to use, things like that. But just the basics in terms of not letting your child or teen be on, I don't know, playing video games the entire time they're home when they're not at school. Just real basic stuff. Trying to ideally have some break before they go to bed, and certainly for some kids that have a harder time disconnecting themselves, helping to kind of set limits with the idea of like helping to teach them over time how to self-regulate that. Eating healthy is important. There are certainly various like fad diets and things like that for ADHD. Again, like from what I've seen in terms of the research, like eating healthy in general is definitely very important. But I feel like the results are fairly mixed in terms of how much of an impact they really make in terms of, at least from what I've seen, in terms of any sort of specific diet for ADHD. But in general, limiting sugar, eating enough protein, the things that again are really good for everyone are certainly usually good for people with ADHD. In terms of like scaffolding at home, so this is the idea by, especially for younger kids, there's a lot of things that may be really hard for them to do. It may be really hard for them to say, I need to sit down and do my homework now. So being able to kind of work on, helping to set up routines that your child or teen can ideally, use themselves, but basically have you help guide them a little bit. So the idea of maybe use a checklist. I'm going to get into a lot more specifics in a few minutes, but, I know checklist is one idea where it's something that, maybe the child ideally could use themselves, but then as a parent, you maybe remind them to use it if they have a hard time getting started. But like the idea is the more you can set up stuff that you kind of have a layer of accountability as a parent, rather than being the primary person to remind them of something, that can often go a long way towards helping them to be more independent and to make a lot of these changes to make things better. And in terms of developing routines, whether it's the morning routine or an evening routine, the other big piece here is it's really important to include your child routine in this conversation, and to the extent that they can, get their input and really try to have them be as actively involved in the process of creating a routine as possible. Because if you create it and force it on them, probably there's gonna be more pushback. But if it's something that they're interested in doing, or at least semi-willing to, and they have some control, even if it's, I don't know, the difference of, do they get dressed or eat breakfast first in the morning? While you may have a strong preference for one way or the other, if it doesn't actually make a huge difference in the scheme of things, letting them pick, the order they do that in, and then map out the rest of the morning may help them to feel more ownership in this process and be more willing to follow it. Or you can also set it up where maybe if they want to, I don't know, let's say do homework at, I don't know, later in the evening, then maybe even though you feel like that maybe that's not a great idea, maybe you set up a plan where you let them try it for 1 week, and you have certain criteria that if they meet it, you'll let that continue. But if they don't meet that, then they'll agree to do it your way in terms of doing homework right after school. Because sometimes just giving kids an opportunity to test something out for themselves, but the caveat to that is setting up a way to really measure it so you can prove if it worked or didn't work. Because the other problem is if you try to let kids do it themselves, and this is disagreement after on whether it worked or not, then you're kind of back to square one with battling it out over, sort of your feelings on a routine versus what the child wants to do in a situation. Okay, so I figured we would just do a quick case example, just to think about some things that kind of relevant to stuff we've already talked about. So we have Jack, who's a 12-year-old male. He just got diagnosed with ADHD by his pediatrician. So these are some difficulties. So, difficulties with emotion regulation, getting ready for school, going to sleep, getting homework completed. A lot of things that are pretty common for someone his age with ADHD. Okay, so in terms of just taking what we talked about a few minutes ago regarding supports, two things I would recommend in this situation would be, psychotherapy to address the emotion regulation piece. Because even if, let's say, there are issues, there are issues from this with, can we track homework assignments? Coaching is not really going to help necessarily that much with emotion regulation. That's where really sort of a psychotherapist or therapy, I think, would probably be most helpful for that piece of it, and it's low self-esteem. And those are things that, really sort of a mental health professional really would probably be the best person to address. Certainly working with a pediatrician or a psychiatrist to look at stimulant medication could be helpful. And then getting some supports in school would be useful. So those are kind of like the three, maybe the biggest things to kind of look at when someone first gets diagnosed. And again, not everyone that has ADHD takes medicine, or makes sense for everyone with ADHD to take medicine. It's not a requirement by any means. But, a lot of people, certainly it can be very helpful. So it's definitely something to sort of examine, but it's not something that you should feel forced into, into sort of saying, you have to put your kind of medicine for ADHD. That's not the case. Okay. So, with this example for Jack, so, again, if you work with a professional, it can be very helpful to collaborate with them. And so that's where maybe with a therapist, or a coach, depending on the circumstances, you might work with them on helping to set up morning and evening routines for Jack. And maybe having a list of chores and sometimes complete them by creating that structure. Really, like the more you can write down and, make a simple list of it, and have a way to remind them of that, but ideally something they can do themselves. So again, I'll get into some more civics in general, but even just thinking of using, Google Calendar notifications, or if you have an Alexa or Google Home, anything that, can really remind someone of something, or, a paper checklist, but something that, each person's different, but just something that your child routine is willing to use and try out and be able to go off of. Because the biggest thing is a lot of kids insist on trusting their memory. Usually memory is not the most reliable thing when it comes to trying to remember to do things, especially under certain time constraints. And other things I would do with Jack, for example, would be think about the transitions. So I mentioned the motion regulation issues before. So if there are a lot of meltdowns when he's going from one thing to the next, if let's say, after he has a snack in the afternoon, he does homework, there has to be a transition to do something after a snack. He can't sit for several hours, most likely eating a snack. So then that might be a really good time to start homework, because he has to transition out of whatever eating the snack anyway. But if you say you can have 30 minutes of video game time and then homework, some kids can do that and it's fine. But if that causes a meltdown with Jack every time he has to disconnect from something, it's probably because it's not a natural transition that he truly has to stop for any reason other than supposed to in terms of how it's set up at home. it's probably better to kind of use the natural transition to be able to help him to get stuff done, or to be able to go to do homework, whatever else he needs to do. Same thing, like after dinner can be a really good example of a natural transition, because most kids are not going to sit forever eating dinner. At least you'd probably hope not. So basically the idea is figure out what do they need to do. So is it they pack up for school the next morning after dinner, or do they make their lunch? But basically using the natural transitions to help in terms of timing can be really useful. I mean, the example I gave here is just for in terms of homework, like having a set structure. So maybe, the child or teen sits down, they look at their planner or the online portal, they make a list of everything they need to do for today, and then they estimate completion times. Because one of the things is when you make a plan, if the plan's not realistic at all, it's going to be hard to follow. The other piece of planning in general is that you have to have flexibility. One of the things I hear the most is that kids are hesitant to make a plan because they feel like no matter what they do, they're not going to follow it exactly. I mean, and that's true. No matter how good a plan no matter how good anyone is at planning, it's rare that it ever works like down to the exact minute. But that's where you have to have flexibility, where you use the plan as sort of a general guide, but with the understanding that things may come up, things may take longer than you think. But if you can have some sense of an estimate of how long something might take, then it's going to be easier to plan accordingly. Because if, according to your estimates, the homework you have planned to do is going to take 5 hours and you have 1 hour free, clearly it's not going to work. But also, if you realize that the time is not going to work, you can then readjust the plan. And then maybe if not everything's due tomorrow, do some stuff, plan to do some stuff the next day and spread it out more. But not really knowing how long things are going to take can be especially tough. And that's something that's quite common with ADHD, is to not really have a good sense of time. And one way to help with that is to basically actually track time doing stuff. Use a timer, or there's a program called Toggle, and basically you can use those programs and you can track the actual time that you're doing stuff. You can click start and stop button, and then it creates a nice log. You can use it from a tablet, from a computer. You could obviously just use a stopwatch and write down in paper log. But the idea is then by keeping track of how long certain things are actually taking. If it's if you have math homework and it's usually the same amount of problems, there's a good chance it's going to take roughly the same amount of time each day. But if you continue to go through the motions doing it, but still have absolutely no idea how long it takes, it's going to be hard to plan. But if you actually track the time, then you're going to be able to see, oh, it took me 15 minutes today, it took me 12 minutes yesterday, and then start to get a clearer sense of how long it's going to take so you can plan more effectively. Okay, and then in terms of Jack, kind of as I mentioned earlier, there, in addition to the typical supports of maybe therapy and medication and stuff at school, some secondary stuff. I mean, in Jack's case, I suggested the coaching piece may be sort of secondary to everything else. For some kids, that may be sort of a first kind of thing to do. But then also things like biofeedback or CogMed are things that more of, I think, if everything you're doing is not enough, to sort of examine if something like this would be helpful in terms of like a secondary thing to help further assist things. Okay, so in terms of very practical tools, and the rest of this presentation is all very practical, because I definitely love to focus on practical stuff, but obviously you have to have a basic understanding of stuff to get to that point. Okay. So in terms of time management, one of the simple things that can be helpful to do is to basically make a list of everything that you need to do and have this written down in one place. So for kids, it could be in a Google Doc, it could be on a piece of paper, and then simply list out everything you have to do today, estimate completion times I mentioned earlier, and then use that plan as a starting point to get going. Okay, in terms of some specific ideas for what to use to track tasks, there's pretty much endless options, but for electronic options, you could use things like a Word or a Google Doc. You use a task list app or a notes app. For paper options, you can use a notebook. If you're using a paper agenda book, you can put it in there. You can use a whiteboard you have near the homework area. The other piece of it is it's helpful to work with children and teens on keeping track of events. And this can be, the school day, days off from school, doctor's appointments, after school activities, like from a young age, getting them to really focus on their own schedule, even if you're sort of ultimately managing it, can be really helpful, because it gets them to think about, how do I use a calendar? Even just, if you have a shared family calendar, giving them access to, let's say, one that has their events on it, allows them to start to see events, or maybe they get a habit of adding their own events in, but it just gets them to really think about organizing their time. But part of that too, and this is where a task list connects with a calendar, is also sometimes having blocks of time free on a calendar to do certain tasks. So for example, having a block of time for homework each day. And if your child or teen has different activities each day of the week, it may be that the homework time is not the same each night, but that maybe every Monday is the same, or maybe every Wednesday is the same. But let me just make sure there's nothing. Okay. Okay, so in terms of civic programs that you can use for your children or teens, or actually a lot of these you could probably use yourself if you want as well. In terms of formal task list apps, so there's a reminders app that's pretty much standard on any Apple device. So any sort of iPhone, iPad, it basically serves a basic function. You can have, your task, the newer versions have subtasks. You can basically set a day and time. Anything that has a set day or time actually allows you to, it gets put into a schedule section. So it kind of makes a daily to-do list for you. To-do list, is a little bit more comprehensive, that it has some additional planning features. Google Tasks is kind of cool. So Google Tasks, for your kids that have essentially a Google email account for school, you can actually, Google Tasks opens up in the same window as the email account. And you can click, so if they get an email with notification from Canvas or wherever saying, here's a new assignment, then click a button and that assignment automatically gets added to the Google task list. So depending on how kids get assignments or what they need it for, same thing if they get an email about something, like if they have to, I don't know, write a teacher back or something, then click a button and it gets put in the to-do list. So this way it's automatically there for it. Because really, like, the simpler things can be, the better. The more, in most cases, the more automated something is and the easier it is to add something to a list and get reminders on it, the more likely someone is to follow through on actually taking action on the task. And by the way, this is an example of the reminders app. So basically you would have that where it says today, that's essentially the scheduled stuff. And so again, even for kids, 5, 6, if they're on a device anyway, you can sort of help them to set some of this stuff up. And it's a nice thing because then they can have a checklist for it. So it's a nice, easy way to get organized. And for those of you that, that have an iPhone, have never actually used the reminders app, you search reminders on your phone, it should come right up unless you deleted it. And it's really it's a great basic task list, because there's a lot you can also set reminders based on location. So for example, like let's say I don't know, you want to remind your child or teen to, let's say, unpack their lunch when they get home. That if they have a cell phone, basically you can set it up so when they walk through the front door, the alert goes off to unpack the lunch, because of location based reminders as well, or you can do based on time. Or like, let's say they need to remember to, I don't know, give a certain form to a teacher or hand in a certain homework assignment. Obviously, if I know they probably can't check their phone during parts or any of the school day, depending on their age, but at least first thing in the morning before they go into school, they can get the reminder to, make sure you hand in this assignment. Okay, if this is G-Tasks, so this is another one that's similar. This is one that actually combines a calendar and a task list together. Because, for some children and teens, even adults, there can be a benefit of seeing a calendar and a task list in one place. Other things you can actually do that can be really helpful is with Canvas, for example, and pretty much most other school portals as well. You can sync the calendar feed to an external calendar. So you can view all the assignments from Canvas in an external calendar, and you can also do that in this kind of program. So for example, here, you could put all the assignments in G-Tasks, and you see it here in a calendar along with all the tasks. And so it may make it a little bit easier to kind of organize everything in one place, or for your child or teen to organize everything in one place. Okay, and so I guess I got ahead of myself. So in terms of ones that kind of go together, in terms of a calendar task list in one, this is an example of a couple of programs. G-Task, which I just showed you. iCalendar, this is not the one made by Apple, contrary to what maybe insinuated based on the name, but it's a freestanding program. I think it's made through Symphony's company or something, but basically it connects the reminders app to an external calendar. And so this way you can see all of your reminders based, like if you have, I don't know, if your child has, let's say, walk the dog at 3 p.m. each day, they can actually see that in their calendar as well as in the reminders app. And then this, because it visualizes the time for it, because some kids do really well with a list of times, some like seeing the actual blocks of time can be really useful. And again, you can also sometimes some kids really like that flexibility to kind of create stuff in whatever way they want. So using a notes app or Evernote can be another way to have a little more flexibility over the organizational structure of how someone is organizing a to-do list or keeping track of stuff. I think what's hard is that some kids really want to kind of do it themselves and organize it themselves. And if they can create a structure and stick with it, that's great. But sometimes it can be hard at the beginning or in general to kind of take that extra step to organize it, whereas sometimes having something that's preset and you just fill it in can sometimes be easier. Okay, in terms of some non-electronic ideas for keeping track of tasks is, a simple notebook. You don't have to have anything that's super complex. A notebook that you have devoted to keeping track of tasks can be useful, or using a formal planner. PlannerPad is one example of a planner you can purchase that is often sort of used. A lot of people at ADHD find it quite helpful because it just goes the way it's formatted. Or even using a large whiteboard with or without a calendar. The key thing here, though, is it depends where you're going to be keeping track of stuff. So, for example, if you have a child or teen that does a lot of homework at school, having a whiteboard at home as the primary method of keeping track of stuff is probably not super helpful because they're not going to have access to it. Whereas having something that's portable, whether it's electronic or in written form, is going to be helpful unless they're only doing work in one place. Okay, in terms of general calendar, certainly there are lots of calendar options, but most of them are not dramatically different. So basic Google Calendar or iCal often can work quite well, or for non-electronic stuff, large wall calendar or whiteboard calendar. In terms of physical organization, this is another thing that can often be really important to think about. I don't know, think about how many of you at home have kids that can't lose stuff very easily. Trying to figure out where your keys, or some kids lose their cell phones a lot. Others, they're pretty attached to it, so they don't lose that often. But thinking about even just basic school supplies, the more you can kind of have like a set place for things, but something that's really intuitive. That especially if you work with your child or teen, let's say it's organizing their room or some common area, basically figure out like what's logical to them in terms of where they might put stuff, because then it's going to be easier to follow through on keeping it organized. But that's also where, in addition to whatever system you set up and organize initially, one of the keys to maintaining whatever you set up is to have frequent check-ins where you figure out, is anything out of place? Because a lot of times kids with ADHD, it's sort of this all or nothing principle. Either it's super organized, or once things sort of get out of place, it's hard to kind of get back into this, I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna get this organized. It's until maybe it's a massive disaster. And so by sort of having, let's say, even like at a certain time each day, you look in your room and figure out, are there any clothes on the floor? I don't know, is there clean laundry that hasn't been put away? Basically by having like a quick check each day, same thing you could even do with a locker, where basically you have, is there anything out of place? And each day check it, so that this way it prevents things from piling up. Another like practical thing to think about with physical organization, going back to what I mentioned a minute ago, this idea of thinking about things logically. So if you have a child or teen and there's dirty laundry over the floor, even though they have a hamper, it's not getting in there, you might want to explore with them, like, why does it not get in there? This may seem sort of ridiculous and simple, but like one of the things I found often works with that is figure out, where do they actually get undressed in the room? So if, let's say, the hamper is in the closet or the far side of the room and they sit on their bed and get undressed, if you put the hamper right in front of the bed, there's more of a chance that clothes are going to go into the hamper because there's no extra step involved. Literally, it's right there when they're getting undressed. So, same thing with, I don't know, let's say there's something they have to remember to bring to school with them. If you leave, if they have it in front of the, let's say the front area, there's more of a chance they're gonna get that visual cue and see it and remember to take it. So the idea of just, and again, this is obviously not all electronic, but the idea of really thinking about like visual cues and things that are logical, and also grouping things together can be really helpful. So if a child has to remember, I don't know, let me just take my wallet or keys, or I don't know, some other little thing, they may be more likely to forget it. But if you group a couple of these together, like if, let's say, you have your like a watch, a wallet, a phone, and all those things sort of all next to each other, if you group a couple of these together, you're probably more likely to remember to get them each day, because same thing where if, like, let's say your child remembers to brush their teeth, but they're not good at, I don't know, using, let's say, some sort of acne wash they're supposed to use. If you put the acne wash next to the toothbrush, that as long as they remember to brush their teeth, they're going to see the acne wash, and it's going to cue them in to remember that, oh, I need to wash my face as well. Okay. So one other thing would be really helpful with ADHD, and then by the way, I forgot to mention earlier, but I did plan time for questions. So probably about 5 to 8 minutes, I'll start answering questions. And it looks like there are already at least 1 or 2 in the chat. Okay, so this is, I think, one of my favorite things with ADHD is this idea that a lot of people with ADHD tend to fidget a lot. So it's this extra movement, like sort of, leg shaking, fiddling with things. But what a lot of people don't realize is that in a lot of cases, those things occur when someone's bored or they're not sufficiently stimulated. But basically, by actually harnessing the fidgeting in a controlled way, you can actually help your child or teen to actually be more focused. And so if we're doing homework, a couple of things that could be really helpful for homework are help your child or teen to get some movement in while doing homework. So for example, things like a desk bike. Basically, you stick it under the desk and you can pedal while you do homework. And a lot of these things are pretty inexpensive. I mean, that's probably, I don't know, $25 on Amazon. So it's not super cheap, but it's not, not talking hundreds of dollars or anything. But the point, but you can also you can use also whatever you have at home. Like if you have something like a cushion, you can use it sort of as a wobble cushion. So basically you can use it to sit on, you can put your feet on it, but basically like something like this, you have to almost move a little bit in order to hold still. And so it creates a little bit of movement. Or a wobble chair is another example. I mean, other things you can do are, some kids really, especially young kids, like sort of end up standing up quite a bit when they do homework anyway. So maybe you can set up the desk area in a way where it could be sort of a standing desk. And then they could either just stand or, they could use something like a balance board, while they're standing. And so the idea is that the movement's supposed to be sort of minor and mindless, because any sort of like fidget thing you're using really should be mindless. Because so for example, let's say if I'm playing with this while I'm trying to do homework or something, even if I'm listening, I'm clearly not focused fully on, if it's homework, whatever's in front of me. If I were to be doing that during a class, my visual attention is clearly not 100%. So the idea is whether it's something with your hands or your feet, it's really important to make sure that the fidget stuff, it's all mindless. In terms of other fidget stuff, I mean, all fidgets are not created equal. I mean, you can buy like massive bags of them on Amazon pretty cheaply. But basically, if you look at different fidgets, I mean, some are better than others. I mean, so for example, like something like this, where you can sort of hold it and, I'm not looking at it, I'm really not even thinking about it. It's going to be sort of mindless. That's a good example of fidget. One where I could easily play with it. Like, for example, if I want to start juggling, I imagine that probably is going to be distracting and I'm probably getting myself off task. So it's that kind of thing is certainly, again, you have to be careful of the fidgets. But, like another example might be like something like this, a very small one that you can hold, can be a good fidget because it's mindless. So, but each person's different. That's where it's really important to get a sense for each person, what they want to try, what works, what doesn't. But again, also especially for homework, if a child or teen is mostly, typing, for example, and they need both hands, probably a hand fidget's not great. That's where doing stuff with the feet, like the pedals I mentioned, or, these, I mean, a lot of kids in classes have these, they're called kick bands. You basically put them on the chair and then people can, basically you can pull in or push back with the feet. So a lot of different stuff you can use. It's important to think outside the box and you can try different things and kind of see what works. Or one other idea, actually, if you want to do hands, is something like this. That's sort of a hand weight. And especially for kids that have a lot of tactile sort of needs, it's because you can control the tension on it. It can be helpful for that because you can adjust it based on how much pressure someone wants to put on it. Okay. I mean, other stuff in terms of homework time, for example, that's that's pretty basic is producing physical distraction. So there's a lot going on around you. Some sort of noise canceling headphones, a machine. Putting up like a visual barrier if you're sharing, let's say, a living room with someone and you're trying to do homework. Trying to face away from windows, other things would be distracting. In terms of reducing electronic distractions, putting a phone on do not disturb if you have a phone, or putting ideally in another room. You can use a separate web browser for work and non-work items. There are also programs you can use that will block access to certain websites. Some of these are a little bit harder to activate depending on the one if you're on a school Chromebook because of the privacy rule settings, but some you can still activate. Like there's Freedom, which is a computer program that works both with software as well as websites. There's Stay Focused, there's Cold Turkey. There are definitely a bunch out there. And here's sort of a list of, this is the last slide. So here's a list of, I think, a bunch of ones I mentioned. There might have been a few on here that I didn't get to, but a lot of ones I found are really good for different uses in terms of technology.